Good evening. It's wonderful having you. As I mentioned to you when we were speaking before, I feel a little giddy. It's like having two heroes, being able to be the one asking the questions. So I always think that it's important at the beginning of any conversation, whether it's personal or in public, to tell our stories. And so I would ask that each of you take this opportunity to tell a bit of your stories. Who are the people who impacted your life? Who are your heroes? In fact, how did you get to where you are now?
You go first.
I'm looking at you.
He's taller, so you do it. David?
Well, I mean, there's lots of influences. I think my father was a big influence on me. My father, David Gregory, who just died about a month ago, was a larger-than-life figure. It's interesting. I was afraid of him growing up, and we had difficult relationships, but also a very loving relationship. And he loomed large in my life because he was the one who really cultivated ambition in me, a desire to perform at one level, and a desire to kind of keep pushing and keep learning and keep striving. So he was a really big influence on me. I think, in the world of journalism, certainly Tom Brokaw, among others, were big influences on me. And, I think, my own story was one of, growing up and from a very early age being very self-directed and very ambitious about a career in journalism and in striving, something that I was able to achieve very early and with great success. And then I still think at a pretty young age in the middle of life, having a really big setback in that very important career at a time which had predated the setback, when the questions that are really, I think, at the center of life, which is how to live and who am I, and how do I understand human nature, and how do I understand my own existence, started to take on greater importance for me. And so, I have become a deeper person of faith, and I have gone through some experiences that have both deepened my faith, but also given me kind of a more grounded identity in the middle of life as I prepare for my next chapter.
And your mother wasn't Jewish, as I recall from your book.
She was not. She was a lapsed Catholic, Irish, which is why I look like a nice Irish kid. And they were, religion for my parents was not terribly important. They tried to negotiate the path through compromise. My sister was baptized, actually, and I was going to be raised as the Jew, and then that changed. But then they were both, I was bar mitzvahed, she was bat mitzvahed, so that changed.
Erica, what about you? What's your story?
If I tell you, can I keep the mug?
You can keep the mug. Even if you left the stage right now, you could have the mug. I'll give you two more as mug. Okay.
There's so many influences, and it's hard in a short span of time to explain them. A place was a very important influence for me. I grew up in Deal, New Jersey, and I would say that my relationship with nature was profoundly influential for me in terms of cultivating my own spiritual life. My mother was a child survivor of the Holocaust. My grandparents were
born in Germany?
Born in Poland.
Born in Poland.
My grandparents both were in Auschwitz, unbeknownst to each other. One was freed by the British and by the Americans a day apart, and it took a year to find everybody. So my mother was reunited with her parents. And I would say that the Holocaust never again, almost oppressive weight of being Jewish was what I grew up with, but also the miracle of my own existence was always apparent to me. If we survived and our family was able to come through this and remain whole, then that must mean something in terms of what I have to do on this planet. My grandparents were Ger Hasidim, and they lived in a very small village called Zakrzewik in the south of Poland, south of Lublin. And they came to America in the 50s. They had spent time in Germany. and rebuilt a life. They had a chicken farm in Jackson, New Jersey, which was a total failure. But my mother had to, collect eggs in the morning before school. And they worked really hard to rebuild a life. And in many ways, you wouldn't recognize the Holocaust on them, because they both were full of humor and love and gratitude. And I think that was very formative for me. My parents were divorced. My parents divorced. They were separated from the time I was 11 and officially divorced at 16. And I think I was looking for an alternative lifestyle. My grandparents left their Hasidic background when they came to America. They stopped being Sabbath observant. Always had a relationship with the synagogue, but not really, but left with bad associations of their growing up. As I became observant through a youth group, my youth group involvement at 12 and 13, you have to teach yourself how to pray and teach yourself how to observe, and being a vegetarian, so because my home wasn't kosher. And it's hard. It's hard to do it when you're young and you're under your parents' influence. It's hard to create that separate identity. But in one of life's great ironies, now they're all ultra-Orthodox. And my grandfather began to wear tefillin again at the age of 75. So it's been a really interesting journey.
You've talked about how you came here physically, but you have become by cab. That's a long way from Washington. It must have been. Are we paying the bill?
It was. You are.
But you have become considered a great scholar in Jewish life, and really a mentor, and probably not the right word, a spiritual consultant, not only to David but to others. So how did that happen?
Well, I met David in an interesting way. We have a mutual friend who had met with David, and David expressed some desire to learn more about Judaism, and he said, I have someone, to meet, and we arranged to meet in a Starbucks near American University 8 or 9 years ago, and I never watched David's program. I don't watch TV, really. So I think he was a little insulted.
That must make you feel terrific.
Right.
Your great strength is not being plugged into the culture.
Right. And I just said, I'm not even going to know who he is in the Starbucks, but he has a very telegenic personality, so I figured it must have been him. And the relationship started from there in terms of study and trying to understand what David wanted out of his journey and accommodate it. And then we brought together a community of people. I said, David, you can't be Jewish alone. And when we learn and study, there's power in community. And so we had a number of people join us, and I guess we'd call it a media group.
Mm-hmm. But if I could just say, for me, what I was looking for, Rabbi, was I didn't know what I was looking for. The way I would describe it now is a kind of spiritual longing, a longing to kind of grapple with the questions, how do I live a life of meaning and purpose, and how do I figure that out? And I thought, well, maybe it was greater involvement in Jewish institutional life, maybe it was greater immersion into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I didn't know, and I was searching, and a mutual friend introduced me to Erica, and she would minimize this, but she is really a holy person. And I met her and was in discussion with her and said, she's who I've been looking for. It was, without any doubt in my mind, a transcendent experience to meet her, to encounter her, and to develop a friendship with Erica around kind of understanding identity and learning and spiritual growth. I don't like the word spiritual consultant. She is certainly a spiritual advisor of the.
Is that a high-paying job?
What's that?
Is it a high-paying job?
Yeah,
You're the one to tell us. Right?
In fact, she gets paid, in certain circumstances, would never allow me to pay her, which made me very uncomfortable because I thought, this isn't right. But it is kind of, was very instructive to me about that sense of calling that Erica has to be a teacher. And, it just became a unique relationship.
It's so interesting because there's a certain symmetry in your lives in terms of your family backgrounds. But you write in your book that it was actually, there were two things that I think were pivotal in your kind of instigating your search. One was President Bush's question, how's your faith? And the second was your wife's question, what do you believe? And you said those were instigating moments for you. And So I just want to confirm that's true, what that meant, but also I want to know if that's, I mean, in some way, do you believe that there has to be an instigating moment, or is there something that's yearning within all of us? Are some people born with it? Do other people just, find themselves searching? Are they taught it? David, for you, tell us more about what kind of impelled you forward.
Well, the way I would describe it now, because I don't think, I've never stayed at the same point, but I think what I've come to understand is this yearning I was feeling was really a yearning to understand identity. Who am I? And how do I understand human nature and how to live? How should I live? And really, what Beth, who's a Protestant, grew up in the Methodist Church, was not interested in converting, but was willing for our family, for our kids to be Jewish, and for us to be a Jewish family. She said, look, you've got to be the real deal here. You have to know what you're talking about. We were talking a few moments ago. I grew up in Los Angeles, Jewish, culturally Jewish, ethnically Jewish, but without any real belief or education. And so that question of what is it you really believe was a blanching sort of question, because, well, I'm not sure. I don't really know. I haven't really sat with that question. So for me, the instigating moment was first of all, a sense of deep gratitude for where I was in my life and trying to find the language of gratitude and trying to live that. But ultimately it was, well, what does it mean to be Jewish? And therefore, what does it mean to live with a sense of meaning and purpose as a Jew and more broadly as a person of faith? That to me was the longing. That was the desire, and that was the starting point. I think the question started to grow and to mutate as I started to encounter different things.
So does there need to be that kind of moment for people, or some people, yourself for instance, did you find it along the way? Was it trained into you?
Yeah, for me, I think it was more incremental than an actual moment, but I do feel that I am with a lot of adults in a transformative moment, and I would say that as an adult educator, that's what I'm most interested in, is helping people arrive at a place where they can make a decision and bring their whole self into that decision. Sometimes they're painful decisions. I think that what religion does is it equips people to go through milestone and liminal events and cushion sometimes the harshness of them or the transitions involve a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty. And I think where religion does its best work is cushioning that anxiety and allowing people to go in across the lifespan into experiences. Often I'll have someone who comes to study with me who's just lost a parent or has gone through an illness or is a recovering alcoholic or something where they need to hold on to something and they didn't have a lexicon before. And that's what they're looking for. Someone who does research, Diane Tickton-Schuster, Dr. Schuster has done a lot of research on adult education. She believes that only at disruptive moments or disjunctive moments, when we feel there's something missing, do we seek to educate ourselves. But I think when people are in the process of learning, especially learning in community and thinking about their personal growth, I think they don't realize how much fun it is. They don't realize how beneficial it is to surround yourself with like-minded people who also want to grow. I've said this many times, and David and I have talked about this many times. Comfortable people don't grow. And so the job of a teacher, I believe, and education generally, is to make people uncomfortable enough to learn, but safe and loved enough to integrate and come back.
I'm listening, and I realize there are probably a fair number of people in this audience here and and in the live streaming audience who are saying, look, I'm Jewish. My identity is clear, right? My Jewishness is clear. And here are these two people speaking about something for which I neither have the language nor necessarily right now the longing, which is the Judaism part of it. I mean, when you talk about being Jewish and you both talk about faith, there's a level of God in that, right? And there's also a matter of faith, which is an add-on for many people to their identity, to their Jewishness. How do you talked about disruptive moments, and at some point everybody has them, but not everybody necessarily thinks about, well, I need God in my life, or I need faith in my life, or I should be studying. I'd be interested, David, you've gone through it, but I'd be interested in what you would say to them, and Erica, what you would say to them.
Well, I think this is something that's particular to Judaism and Jewish identity. And this is how I grew up as well. And a lot of people grow up, non-Orthodox Jews, basically, and I think the majority don't really know what Judaism is about. They understand tradition, they understand ritual practice. They don't really seek that kind of the experience of the divine. Nor do I think, do they view Jewish law and the kind of ethical canon as a means of self-improvement. Abraham Tversky, the psychologist and rabbi, talks about Torah as character refinement. And so there is this question of living in relationship to God, in relation to God, as a Jew or as a person of faith, that I think is that is about personal disruption. As I tell a story, when there was a piece that was written about Chris Matthews in the New York Times Magazine, and it was a pretty unflattering piece about him. And one of the things he says in there, the reputation that I had was being pretty ambitious. And I guess Chris Matthews had joked in an anecdote that was written about by the writer that he and Tim Russert and Andrew Mitchell were getting on a plane, and Chris Matthews said, "Oh, I'm sure David Gregory is somewhere off here hoping this plane goes down." And there was a reference to me wanting to do hardball or something like that. And the writer asked me about it, and I said, "Oh, I'm sure he was just kidding," or something like that. I don't have any comment about that. And when the piece came out, I remember talking to Erica, and she said, "You should write Chris a note, and tell him you're thinking about him." And I said, "Well, why would I do that? Given what he said." He said, "Because, it's just kind of a giving thing to do." And I said, "Well, right, but my heart wouldn't be in it if I did it." And then what's the thing? This is why it's so great to have her right there.
They're feeding that line to me.
Right. That if you do the right thing, even if your heart is not in it, eventually your heart will be in it, doing the right thing. And I did it, and it was a kind of transcendent moment between Chris and I, and he had a wonderful response to that. And we had a very good relationship after that, and he was very gracious to me when I left. So part of this, to me, the disruptive moments that we were talking about a moment ago, is about character refinement. It is about a search for goodness, and it is about not relying on our tradition and what our tradition asks of us and teaches us in the way that is very much a discussion about what we believe and who we want to be.
As I'm listening to this, I'm thinking that in a way, your meditations and what you've taught and your reaction to what Erica suggested would be considered counterintuitive. They are not the way that you were caught up short when she said,
right,
write him a note. And your meditations in certain ways kind of made me stop and think, is that who we are, that other side that you are in a certain way teaching us to take stock of?
I think that any time you can frame your day in a mindful and intentional manner, that you'll be happier living with yourself by the end of the day. So the idea, at least of this book, was to have a very brief 250-word essay on a particular aspect, character building, or a particular aspect of faith development, and then a challenge at the end. To just, I think good habits develop when you do them repeatedly. So in the sense that there's a discipline that we put towards this, and there's a stretch goal also. I'm always, the two things that make adult education really hard for me right now. One is the presence of cell phones. It's very, very hard for people to disconnect and say, Hineni, I'm fully present in this moment, and I'm fully present in this classroom. And the other is how many Jewish people say, I don't need to study, I go to yoga. Mm-hmm. And I am not in any way minimizing the importance of exercise or mindfulness that comes through body movement, quite the opposite. When people say, oh, Jews, they're not very spiritual. I know a lot of Jews who follow Buddhism. I know a lot of Jews who are seeking and feel the serenity and calm that comes with yoga, and they never explored it in their own backyard.
David, was this hard for you?
No, I think just the opposite. I think what was initially hard was and I spent a lot of time with Erica initially trying to figure out, okay, well, where do I belong in this Jewish picture? What is my Jewish identity? Do I need to become more Jewish? Do I need to pray more? You know, I was trying to really kind of fix myself on the Jewish
And what did more
continuum.
Jewish mean to you in your thinking?
Well, to me, I think initially it was more of a halakhic path. And I was actually warned against that by Rabbi Larry Hoffman. I was telling you that story earlier. And it was Beth who said to me, don't you realize that you are caught up in just a new form of self-absorption by trying to locate yourself in the Jewish mosaic instead of thinking about the turning to religion as a way to understand human nature, to understand myself and understand who I am and who I hope to be. I have a friend who's a minister at a big Methodist church in Washington, D.C., who I write about, Ginger Gaines Cirilli, who sermonized once about us that we're constantly in transition between who we are and who we are becoming, and that we're on this path of becoming who God intends us to be. And that process of transition, of migration, is about personal growth and refinement, and yes, a certain amount of faith and belief that God is present and leading us, inspiring us along that path. So once I got to that place, and Erica was so, not just prescient, but I think open-hearted enough to not judge me, not try to impose her Jewish lifestyle as an Orthodox woman upon me, is when it really opened up for me, because it opened up a spiritual path that made spiritual maturity, growth, and education possible, spoke to me much more than anything else. Because that question of, how should I live? I mean, the Psalms talk about this. The psalmist writes about asking, pleading with God, teach me how to live. And that's what resonates most with me.
Erica, this intentionalness that you talk about, the mindfulness of it, is part of the underlying theme in certain ways of your book, in which you talk about soul, and your book talks about faith. I mean, if I could capitalize two words, we have soul and faith, two words that are actually probably, I would guess, somewhat uncomfortable for people, especially Jews for whom identity is just enough. Why do you think that? I'd love you to place your books in the kind of continuum of Jewish thinking, and in fact where we are, not only as Jews but as a society.
The book that I wrote is not, this newest book is not a Jewish book, and it's also not designed for religious people. It's really designed for people who, for the most part, have a leadership role and have to interact with others and have to use influence rather than power to persuade and grow others, mentor well. So I don't see it as a continuum of a Jewish trajectory as much. I mean, parts of it are certainly informed in the many Jewish texts, but there are also texts from the New Testament, and there's also texts from Buddhism, and there's Picasso and Faulkner. And there's I think, wisdom and creativity and thoughtfulness. They're all different portals into our humanity. So I didn't want to be exclusive, and I wrote it for everyone. I did write. I don't write my books with a particular reader in mind, but I was thinking a lot of David in the writing of this book, because one of the things that evolved as David's career was on the rise and his life became increasingly busy, that the commitment that we made to text study sometimes understandably got compromised. So how do you create, in kind of a bite-sized way, bite-sized wisdom that people can hold on to and just return to every day, and remind, as a reminder, this is who I want to be, as opposed to saying I've arrived.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, well, I think that there's a fundamental seeking and searching in our nature.
Did I say cell phones were the hardest thing that I have to
right?
do?
Especially with that ring, especially. So I think the seeking and the searching is part of our nature. A longing to understand our identities, our sense of purpose, what we're supposed to be doing here, I don't know that we always we don't always create the room for that in our lives. And I've asked Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, I said, why is it that we as Jews don't talk much about God? And he said, well, you know, Jews used to be a God-intoxicated people. But of course, God was so thoroughly indicted through the Holocaust for a generation of Jews. The notion of God's presence, certainly an omniscient God, sort of fell away amid genocide. And yet, if you look in all the sacred texts, and it doesn't have to be an excavation. You can just pick up your morning, you know, your siddur in the morning. And Erica talks about our prayer in the morning about a posture of gratitude. If we read the Psalms, we talk about as Jews, we seek an intimate relationship with God. And I remember I said that to Simon Schama here when I was last here, and he said, "Oh, that's Christianity." I said, "Really? You know, I mean, how about, you know, the idea that even if our parents should abandon us, the belief that God will gather us in, that, you know, that we seek God's face, that we seek to be in God's presence, you know, in time everlasting." So I think for me, it was an expression of a longing that people have, but are maybe uncomfortable talking about. There's a great mystery of God. I'm not a theologian. I can't prove these things, and yet there is the desire and aspiration to live, you know, closer to God and to feel spiritually touched. And I think I feel that, I believe in that, I experience that, and I think that's a very Jewish thing.
This all came to you at a very liminal moment in your life, a time when there was struggle, even to the core of your own identity, as to who you were. How was it for you to redefine yourself?
Well, I'm still in the process. You know, I think the thing for me, Cardinal Dolan, when I interviewed him, he said, you know, one must be careful when you're on this spiritual path, not to make it too much of a project, because faith is ultimately an act of love. It's a dare. In the Gospel of Luke, you know, talking about Jesus says to his disciples that they should cast deep, and they hadn't caught any fish all day, and they said, well, okay, and they do it, and their nets were full. It was a dare to follow that advice, and you know, and the story is that was rewarded. So that process of moving from the head to the heart was partially through the setback that I went through. When I lost my job, I thought, look, I got this covered. I have great love in my life. I have a sense of where God is in this situation. I have perspective. I understand what this is and what it isn't. What I hadn't accounted for was that real blow of identity. And that question of who am I, that I thought, oh, no, but I'm this person of faith and I'm on this path. Well, guess what? You know, faith didn't hold me. I wasn't strong enough, and it was a terrible blow. And I made mistakes, and I struggled with that. But in the course of all of that struggle, faith also teaches. You know, in all of those broken places, there was some light that came in, and there was true humility through faith. And I think faith teaches about humility, which is to say, you know, my life is actually pretty small in relation to God, in relation to, you know, to the greater whole. And that things don't always work out as you plan. But God is still there, and there's love in the world, and there's love of family, and there's a grounded, I think I got more grounded. You know, Psalm 23 talks not just about walking through the valley of death, and by the way, walking through, not staying in, but also that God renews your life. And I had a need on some personal levels to go through a process of renewing my life and renewing that sense of who I am and how I define myself. And that was all very humbling, and is still very humbling, and I think has left me more grounded in faith than ever before. So that was a process, and not a very easy process. And through some painful, you know, moments, you know, I've arrived at a more grounded place, and certainly I have not arrived anywhere.
Eric, my sense is that in David's life, you, probably an overstatement, rescued him at a time, or helped rescue him. Do you think
Just his friend.
Do you think, well, but I want to talk about that. Do you think a person can do this by himself or herself?
Do what?
To find faith, reestablish oneself, rethink oneself?
I think you can, certainly. I know it from my own experience. I think it's easier when you have a mentor or a friend or what we'll call a peer mentor, where the relationship is one of friendship but also growth. I think sometimes we're not hard enough on ourselves, and sometimes we're too hard on ourselves. So the presence of someone else can help. David's very ambitious, and for a while he was my valedictorian, wanting really to master the text and, pursuing it the way that he pursues a lot of things, which is just, full-spirited.
Project.
And it is a project, and you're trying to accomplish something. And there's a point where you say, this isn't about becoming, it's about being. So how are you going to live in this moment? How are you going to deal with the gossip in your office? How are you going to deal with people who try to cut you here and there and everywhere because of the competition of the field? So I was an observer of the culture that David was in, and he's trying so hard to be someone that's countercultural to the toxicity sometimes that of the NBC
But Erica, I mean, first of all, Erica is a very modest person. I mean, she is. I love this woman very deeply. But but in part because she is. She's more than a friend. I mean, she's someone who I think operates on a very high level, and that's meant a great deal to me. And she's guided me and been tough on me, and sort of been pointed in ways that other people cannot be, and yet always loving and supportive as a friend. And, one of the things that resonates with me about her book and why I was so pleased that she wrote it, because, very early on, Erica said to me, look, it's all well and good to kind of cultivate this inner life and refine your character and work on your struggles with anger or selfishness or other, things that are flaws, and kind of compartmentalize that and do it through ritual observance and do it at home and all of this. But you have to bring it to work. You have to bring it into the rest of your life. And I think that's one of the kind of the fragility of our spiritual lives, is that they're ghettoized in a sense, where we think about it, maybe we engage in it through yoga, or maybe we might do it by going to synagogue or church, but to really be and sit with it and as the Psalm says, to put God before us always, that takes some real work. And this idea of bringing your soul to work is a story. When things started to go badly for me at Meet the Press, there was a piece in the Washington Post that was a really tough piece about me, and included some erroneous information that set off this kind of firestorm. As if that piece wasn't bad enough, this thing took off all over the internet, and it was bad. And I was really battling with my bosses about how we were going to deal with this. And I said, look, I'm bleeding here. You got to shore me up. I know Washington. You got to help out. And I asked Erica to come study with me, and I was on the phone with somebody, and I said, I'm battered and bloodied, but I'm still standing. And I get off the phone, she said, David, I hear you using all these images of war, but you're not talking about love at all. And I said, really? I said, we're going to talk about, do you have any idea what's going on here to me? And I said, yeah, I'm not thinking about love. And she said, these are the moments. She said, who is it that you want to be? Who does God expect you to be in these moments? And part of me was like, not now, my friend, not now. But her point was, no, it's precisely now. And we studied Proverbs 4, right, which is did I quote that accurately earlier today?
I think so.
Okay, if you establish the path of your feet, all of your ways will be sure. The lesson being that imagine you are, as Erica taught me, imagine you're facing a maze, and you're on the ground level, and you can't see how to get out of this maze on the other side. But then imagine that you were on the balcony overlooking this, and you say, oh, I see, if I start there and then I can get out the other side. Well, that's in part about charting a course about who you want to be, who you hope to be, and that desire will carry you through those difficult moments. That was my time of testing, to show that I could handle this in a certain way. And so I made mistakes in those periods, but I still was striving toward more graciousness. So that to me is a core piece of what she's talking about in the book, which is we have to, the sense of being and becoming, but being the self that we want to be, that we're trying to be in all aspects of our life. And that's a kind of faith infusion into our whole life, as opposed to compartmentalizing it.
Erica, you talked about the part of your family that came through the Holocaust, and in a way, I think people who go through that can either become victims for the rest of their life or become angelic, to use another tradition's concept. Why did they? What was it about them? But I would also ask about you. What is it about you that strengthens you, that gives you that impetus of faith, of a belief, of the ability to, and I think in some ways intuitively understand other people and speak to them, to their heart?
I think you have to be a good listener. I actually I had a really transformative moment in teaching it was probably about 15 years ago. I've been teaching for maybe 28 years, I think. And at a moment I was teaching a Bible class in Newton, Massachusetts, and it was going to meet regularly. And a woman came with a large JPS Bible, and the class was over. She dropped it on the floor, the way that, a college kid who hates biology might drop a textbook on the floor. And, I try to create a safe and pluralistic classroom, but I went, it was like, you dropped my friend, right? You don't drop my friend on the floor. And I actually understood in that moment that I have a relationship with this sacred text that is not necessarily shared with those I teach. And before, in raising my own children, before they learned to read what is in the Torah, they had a relationship with the Torah. They would go up in synagogue and kiss it. That, you make blessings on it, and you dance around it, and you dress it. So there's a love that develops around the Torah and around text that I think I have, and I didn't do the job of explaining it. And actually, that was an important moment for me because I began the study of hermeneutics, theories of reading, and philosophy, and trying to understand how do you pay attention to where someone else is. I'm not the starting point. All education is about what someone learns. It's not what the teacher teaches. So education has to be about constant engagement, and it can't be that if you're not teaching one person at a time, even in a full classroom.
So I would wonder, you both talk in your books about grace, which, as one who studied Christian theology and Tillich and the whole palette, what exactly is that, and what does it mean, and where does it come from?
Well, you're the teacher. You can answer bigger questions.
And that was a punt.
I'll tell you about what. For me, I like to think about kind of standing in the flow of grace, the idea of God's presence and God's love, and the gifts that God gives us, however we understand God, not because of who we are, but because of who God is. And I really do believe that when we experience moments of transcendence, the love we feel for a child when they're born, that the idea that you see this child and you would lay down your life without a moment's hesitation is a transcendent moment. To behold nature in a way that kind of takes your breath away, or to feel your smallness in comparison to a walk in the trees in Central Park, or to experience the wonder of your children lighting the Shabbos candles and saying the prayers and feeling the connection of 4,000 years of history, or encountering the common humanity if you feed the homeless. All of these to me are examples of standing in the flow of grace, standing in a way, sort of in God's way, so that we are doing things that where we can encounter moments of the divine and moments of transcendence. Our friend Larry Hoffman talks about he doesn't like the question, do you believe in God? He said, would you ask somebody if they believe in love? People know love, or they don't know love. And if you don't know it, it's a little hard to explain it. The physicality of it, there's great songs written about it. But to experience God, to know God, is, I think, similar to kind of knowing love. And that, to me, is grace.
So we have a rabbinic expression of Chai Olam and Chai Sha'ah, like the dichotomy between those who live for the moment and those who live for eternity. And it's interesting to be in Washington and to teach in Washington, which is a lot about Chai Sha'ah, what's what's popular in the moment, versus what we think helps us touch transcendence and gives something more deep and profound that animates us. When I think about grace, and actually your question would have been even better had Simon & Schuster not told me that grace was not a good book title for this, because it was the title of the book. I think of grace as the blessings that you don't deserve that you get. Now, in an entitlement culture, we think we deserve everything. And when bad things happen to us, we think, how dare a bad thing happen to us? That is not shared by every culture in this planet, where some people are much more in touch with tragedy, live in greater proximity to suffering, and they feel that anything that they get that's positive is an act of grace. So on the one hand, you could say grace is you deserved a parking ticket because you didn't put enough quarters in the meter. But the policeman who was giving you the ticket saw that your birthday was the same birthday as his wife and said, I'll let you go today. In other words, you're getting something that you don't deserve. And I think if we were truly as grateful as we should be, we'd see everything that we have as an act of grace. So I don't think of it in more Christian theological terms of being forgiven for things when you didn't take responsibility for those things. I think Judaism wants you to take responsibility for wrongdoing, and we don't merely say turn the other cheek. But I think that...
But does grace have to just be about forgiveness? I mean, is that how?
No. I think it's about compassion.
But isn't it about God's presence, right? To experience. I mean, do we think of grace as just a gift? Right, a divine gift.
I think of it as a gift, but I can't speak. That's my own. I think of the Hebrew term chet nun nun, chanan, chana, and it was the idea that you're living in a community of compassion, and that if you feel that you get things that you don't deserve, then you also have to give to others what you instead of judging others, praise others, make them feel the abundance of what it means to live as a human being fully.
Yeah, I listen to you and I just think, so how do you begin, right? How do you begin?
Page 1.
Page 1. Yes, it's the first one.
Where's Jackie Mason tonight?
Yes. Page 1. Well, actually, before page 1, you talk about living from the inside out or leading from the inside out, right? And quite honestly, I would say that this book is, you talk about it, taking your soul to work. I think it's as much for the individual just taking your soul anywhere. Anywhere. So I would just tell the people here, this book is worth reading even if you're not working, right? So, and I think it was that important. But you talk about leading.
I think I just want to add, why the work in the title. We spend, for those who work in office jobs, we spend the majority of our day, and if you were in a home office, the majority of our day in a world that sometimes we separate from our houses of worship and our family conduct, and you've got to kind of merge those worlds. They don't always work separately.
Thank you. So this issue of soul and faith. So, David, where do you think we should begin? Any of us? I mean, we're sitting here and we're listening to you. Besides reading your books, which I would say before you even think about beginning, everybody should read your books. But where do you think a person?
Can we take you on the road?
I would consider that a gift of grace.
So,
right.
the thing that I like to be very clear, as I am not any kind of faith leader. I am not a theologian. I am a seeker. I'm a student. I'm a journalist. And I haven't figured any of this out. I don't feel like I'm better than anybody else. I really do feel like, in fact, the more spiritually grounded I become, the more magnified my flaws and weakness are, because I deliberately come into contact with them more often. So maybe I have a higher level of awareness, but that doesn't mean that I've solved the underlying problem. So it can be deeply disappointing to keep running into these elements of human nature that are crouching outside the door. And so to me, the question of my book, How's Your Faith?, invites these attendant questions. Is your faith is what it was when you were a kid? Is have you lost your faith? Where and when do you feel your faith most strongly? And fundamentally, do you think your life would be different and maybe even better if your faith were stronger? And my point is that the answers to those questions for me are no better than your answers. But I encourage you to ask the question, sit with the question, and consider what our faith tradition asks of us: a greater awareness, a greater sense of taking stock, of cultivating quiet in our lives. What are the spiritual asks of us as opposed to just being who we are? And then how do we start to engage in those questions? I think that's a place to start. I think study, prayer, finding a friend, like Erica, who can guide you in that path, reading. But it really does begin with intentionality and cultivating awareness.
It always surprises me, Peter, that the number of people who think if they wouldn't go to a class because it's too Jewish. And I wonder, are there Buddhists who say, too Buddhist? Right? It's like, no, it's too much. And I'm always surprised by that, because if you can get someone through the door and they're sitting in a room and studying and interpreting text and making it relevant to life, you watch people just bloom. And I think to myself, where's the curiosity about this 4,000-year-old tradition? We've conquered so much as a small people. And yet on the spiritual side, there's something very adolescent about us as a people. And I would say that particularly with regard to American Jews, something so surface and all kinds of conclusions based on ill-informed understandings. And I think you wouldn't do that in other arenas of your life. So just that little curiosity about, I think you start by uncovering the curiosity and then saying, what would it be like to be on some journey of self-discovery, Jewish or other? It was where I'm actually making some time for reflection. And David, David has set up this kind of hierarchy that I'm the teacher, but he's much taller than me. And in a peer-mentor relationship that I think we have with each other, I watched someone, I don't know that I could have handled the crisis that David did with the grace that he handled it, and making himself as vulnerable in a public setting. And it's been awe-inspiring. It's been awe-inspiring.
And in a way, I find your book, David, inspiring for that. I mean, you reveal yourself as fully as I think one could reveal oneself, because you were in the public eye in ways that most people aren't, who go through this kind of heartache and hardship and loss. And to be as open as you were about it is really an invitation in for others, which is why
I just wanted to add something, because this isn't, when I read the book in its manuscript form, and then I read it again when it came out, and then I did the book tape, so I totally saturated myself with it. I was very taken in the book by David's discussion of his mother's alcoholism. Mm-hmm. And I think that, if we focus on Meet the Press or focus on the spiritual journey, there's a crisis that a kid goes through at 15, and the pain of it, and the willingness to share that with other people, lest he could provide solace to someone else in a similar situation or in a recovery process. And that to me was heroic.
Yes, it was heroic, and one could ask and think about, well, there are other people who could have been totally destroyed and broken by that. Mm-hmm. I mean, you had a different way of handling that, in some way keeping it secret, but on the other hand, I remember you were angry at a friend who didn't ask you about it or say anything to you, that there was something about, why didn't people see my pain or see what I was living through?
Well, the other part of this, to start with, is that, for me, as a public person and as someone who's gone through something that was very difficult publicly, writing about myself in a really open and vulnerable way was actually much easier, because when you've been heavily criticized or embarrassed, it's much easier to be critical of yourself than to have others do it. And so in a way, that was just refreshing for me to kind of take stock and do all of that. That wasn't as uncomfortable as some people think. And, the story of my mother and her alcoholism in that period is Eric always said that for me the spiritual journey began by trying to understand my family dynamic, and I think that's true because it was the absence of faith at that period of time that looms large. The fact that, nobody really knew what was happening, and there was nobody to tell me, this is a pretty raw deal, but it's going to be okay. It's not the end of the world, and it's going to be okay. And I didn't have that, and I resented it, and I just felt really alone and out of control, and I didn't understand why, as I look back on it, nobody could comfort me through that period of such confusion and anger. And my friend that I write about, as I got older and I confronted him with that, was very upset and felt terribly bad. Even he was reading the book, and I wake up one morning and I see a text. He said, "David, I'm reading the book and I feel so awful, this, that, and the other." And I'm thinking, oh God, I haven't really thought about this in a long time, but he was experiencing that kind of rawness anew. And that was, that part of it is difficult, but it comes with that territory.
We have some questions from across the country, and from right here. So let me just ask a few of them.
5'1", 6'5".
And both Jewish.
Yeah.
Just shows the face of the Jewish people is so complex.
Yes.
So this is from Sands Point, New York, not so far away. Can too much faith in one's own religion make us more or less tolerant of other faiths, whether Christian or Islamic?
Yes. I stand by that, yes.
Mm-hmm.
I think religion should be a tool to help people live better lives, to master negative impulses, to develop intimacy with God, but really to sing the song of humanity. And I'm deeply, deeply troubled by what's happening in the world, because I think it betrays religion. It doesn't support religion, it betrays religion. And I want to be an advocate of faith and feel good when I advocate for faith, because I feel it makes people better and it makes communities stronger and it makes them more compassionate. And now we're seeing the way that it's become part of the arsenal of terrorism. And it's terrifying. Mm-hmm. It's just terrifying.
And yet it's not, I've been spending time reading Sam Harris, and so atheism and all that, and I think he would argue it actually doesn't betray religion. It is a fundamentalist interpretation of religion that is a fundamental problem with religion and intolerance. And yet we, I think particularly in the Jewish tradition, constantly refresh and renew interpretation of our stories in a way that sings the song of humanity.
I love that. I'm going to get the tape and play that back for other people. Did learning more increase your desire to be more religious? How has that affected your family? Yes, but I think,
interfaith marriage is difficult, and it's a big issue in the Jewish community, and I think that it involved a lot more sacrifice that my wife and I recognized. I think she thought, look, I can hang on to my religious, traditions and my religious identity, and I can give this up for the sake of the kids, and we can be a Jewish family, and it'll be okay. And I think my wife Beth actually came to regret that and felt a lot of pain around that. Doesn't regret it totally, but feels compromised, and it's hard. And I didn't fully appreciate and didn't honor her traditions enough in the pursuit of Jewish identity for our family. So along the way, I think we have pursued as much of a kind of universal religious path through ritual observance and prayer as we could. I think that she still finds Judaism exclusive and has a hard time accessing liturgy and the service, and has been more comfortable with, Shabbat dinner on Friday and Passover. So I would say that we've experimented some, and we have created both religious and Jewish identity in a way that is as universal as it can be and as respectful as it can be of Christian tradition too, and kind of our shared values. But it doesn't come easily, and it is a bit fraught.
And there's so much to follow up on that question, but I'm going to move along to a question from Rochester, New York. There are times when we ask God to intervene in our lives because our loved ones are under stress. I was wondering how this is reconciled with the ideas of free will.
Could you repeat that question?
Sure. I will do it slower. There are times when we ask God to intervene in our lives because our loved ones are under stress. I was wondering how this is reconciled with the idea of free will.
You know, I'm not someone who asks God for intervention when it's convenient for me or when I'm in pain, because I feel that as a person who prays every day, that I have a lot of deposits in that relationship, and I'm not just using that relationship or leveraging it to serve a personal need. I think God can carry you through difficult moments so that in some way you levitate above them, but are deeply aware of the suffering. I don't think you can say, you know, God, help me in this moment. And I want to share a story with you, and I don't share this story proudly, but many, many years ago, I was with a group. I took a group to Israel, and I went to say the afternoon service at the Kotel, at the Western Wall. Now, of course, what is like the meanest thing you could do on the Western Wall would be to read someone else's note. I mean, that would be...
It never even entered my mind.
It's the lowest of the low. But let's say the note was lying open. You didn't open it, but it was lying open. So I'm looking at this note on the floor, and you know, there's people crying and praying and bringing their pekalach, all of the baggage to this wall for such a long time. And I look at this note and it says, "Dear God, please fix my camera." You know, if you go down to Jaffa Street, there's a lot of camera stores there. And you know, here I was a student of philosophy. I majored in philosophy. I was thinking, you know, Alpha, Rabbi, and Maimonides, and you know, just so many things were happening in my head when I saw this note. And there was something actually very beautiful about it when I stepped back from it, of the kind of relationship that you bring everything to God, and not only in a moment of despair, you know, in the Foxhole. So I think that if you have an ongoing relationship, I don't think it's so much a question of free will. You're saying, God, just drop in now when I need you, because that also takes away from human empowerment and saying, you know, God put us here to be partners in the world and in a covenantal relationship to partner in bettering the world. And I can't say, I'm giving up, God, now you take over.
I have a definitive answer to that question, which is, I don't know.
But can God fix cameras?
Yeah, well, that no, but I think there's a struggle. I mean, I was not checking my email when she was talking. Erica wrote me, I remember days after I left Meet the Press, and it was a difficult time, and she concluded a note to me by saying, "I leave you with a prayer from Isaiah about putting trust in God right now and in all those who love and care about you. I am he who will sustain you. I have made you and I will carry you. I will sustain you and I will rescue you." And I think that's about God not making things happen or preventing bad things from happening, but about God being close in times of sadness or stress or bereavement. And I believe that, and I think that's my kind of conception of God in those moments. I also don't completely understand, you know, moments like genocide, and you know, what would it be like to have lost your family in the Holocaust or to have experienced the Holocaust, and how to hold on to that sense of God being close in that kind of moment. I haven't figured that out. That's one of the mysteries of faith that I struggle with.
One last question, because we're sadly coming to the end of our time together, or at least this session of our time together. I want to read the last lines of both of your books and ask you to let us know what you think of both what each other said, what you said, and what exactly does it mean. David, you wrote, "I believe God is working on me, helping me to stand in the flow of grace, but I am not alone by any means. The work doesn't end. And Erica,
I think I am not done.
and the
Let's look it up.
we'll look it up. I will look it up.
Yeah.
I am not alone. Oh, and I'm not done. Erica, yours is, thanks for finishing the book with me. There is no volume 2. You can just turn back to page 1. That's what I'm going to do. There's a certain symmetry.
I think when you're on a path, there's a cycle. We tend to think of paths as a straight line, but Jewish time always seems to be spherical, and you're going through a lot of the situations that you've gone through before, asking a lot of the same questions you've asked before, but you're bringing a different package of life experience to those same issues. And so if you're thinking about anger management or patience and impatience or compassion, it was all of these things, they bear down on us again and again, and they lift us again and again. So I think for me also, a lot of goodness is about developing good habits. We have a lot of research, behavioral economists have given us a lot of research about getting rid of old habits and developing new good habits. And that's the iterative process of reading something every day, of thinking, of creating reflective time. That's something you have to discipline yourself to do. And you keep going back. I study a page of Talmud a day. This is a 7.5-year venture, so we're into 3.5 years. And I can't say that every day I understand everything that I'm reading, but I'm very aware of the daily discipline of study and prayer as a frame, a bookend to my days. And thinking about, what we do when we complete a book is we say a prayer that thanks God for our capacity to finish a book. And we acknowledge that tomorrow we're going to start the next book.
Yeah, I think it's something similar for me. I spent a lot of my young life thinking I could build something really big and then just and then arrive and be done. And I was in the process of building, a professional identity and then realizing, oh wait, there's something bad that can happen, and that can kind of derail that. When I approached Jewish learning initially, I thought, okay, where do we start and then where does it end? And when do I get my arms around this? When do I gain mastery, And now I really have figured out the key to being a human being, which is you're just not done. That the work isn't over, that I'll die still being in a place of transition. And so that creates a certain awareness of vulnerability. I'm vulnerable in ways I didn't realize. And so I think the work of our own individual human progress and projects, that we're just kind of constantly in motion. And so I do believe in a sense of the divine being at work inside of me and being what Joel Osteen talks about, having a heart for God, and then being open to the idea that it's a walk that doesn't end and that we're always in motion.
Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that tonight was a gift given to us by our two speakers. You can actually take that part of that gift with you if you will wait and go to the back, and their books are there and they will sign them. But I believe that for me personally, and I think for all of us, tonight had a poignancy that perhaps was beyond expectation, but fully within your souls. And so, Erica and David, I thank you tremendously for being here with us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.